Welcome to the number one comics podcast, the only podcast that's dedicated to first issues. I'm your host, Jonah. With me is Bill. Hey, Bill.
How's it going?
Thanks for joining me on this adventure.
Yeah.
I've been wanting to do a podcast like this for quite a while, and I've been spitballing ideas with people, and glad to actually put this thing together. Special thanks to Josh and the Field of Geeks family for helping us out with this. This is awesome. I'm really excited to do this. And what we're talking about today with our first episode is the comic book that brought me back into comics back in the early 2000s, and that is New Avengers #1 from Marvel. Now, you'd read this just recently. Was that your first time reading it? Was kind of preparing for this episode?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I can definitely see why it would get you back into comics. If I would have picked this up off the newsstand, I probably would have gotten back into it as well.
So just a little bit about the issue and the release. So Marvel Comics publication, January of 2005. Now, it did hit stands, I believe, in November of 2004. Cover price, $2.25, which I think back in like 2004, when I was getting back into comics, I was like, oh man, $2.25. That's a lot of money. And now they're what, $4.99 a pop?
Something like that.
Give or take, $3.99.
We thought it was a big deal when they went from $1 to $1.25.
Or $1.50, $1.75. Yeah, every time it increases, it's a punch in the gut. But I think we're so desensitized to it now that it is what it is.
Oh, yeah,
so,
of course.
The writer on this issue is Brian Michael Bendis, artist David Finch, inker David Meeky, and my apologies if I mispronounced that last name. But like I said, this was my first superhero comic since the mid-90s. Got out of it, I think probably about the same time as you, like 95, 96 is when I kind of got out of it. It wasn't that I discovered girls and all of a sudden comics were not important, but it was just comics were not good and girls were getting better.
Yeah, exactly.
And so my priorities did shift a little bit. This issue in particular was a direct follow-up to Avengers Disassembled. Have you read that yet?
I have, yes.
Okay. I did as well, but I didn't read that until after, well after this. I think I ended up picking that up in trade at some point.
Well, and I didn't read that when it came out either. It was something I went back and after I found out about M-Day and that sort of stuff, I was like, I got to go back and read this. This sounds good.
Yeah, Brian Michael Bendis at the time was like a big architect within the Marvel Universe. And with Avengers Disassembled, he essentially destroyed the Avengers team so that there was no more of an Avengers team. And it's funny because you think of the Avengers now, and they are like one of the premier superhero teams in existence. I mean, they're like JLA level superhero teams.
Absolutely.
In the 90s, they weren't. And so I never really got into the Avengers or followed the Avengers, cared about the Avengers, or really any of the Avengers characters. So this was really the first Avengers comic that I bought as well. What struck me about this and why I gravitated towards it, because I wasn't in the shop looking for this. I was actually in the shop for the first issue of the G.I. Joe when it was relaunched by Devil's Due through Image around the same time. So I was in the shop to buy that, and this just so happened to be on the stand as well.
Right.
And so I picked up, the cover instantly drew me in. You got the big #1. You've got our heroes standing in the shadows, but you're still able to recognize a lot of them. Captain America, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Wolverine. I had admittedly never read much of Iron Man or Captain America up to that point. Now, this entire review is going to be spoiler heavy. Iron Man doesn't even appear in this. He's on the cover, but he's not even in this issue.
Right.
Well, let's go ahead and actually break down the issue, and we're going to do a little bit of a synopsis here and kind of go, not necessarily page by page, but sort of give you some of the story beats. So, and again, spoilers are to follow, but we're talking about a 20-year-old comic at this point.
Right,
so if you haven't read it yet, you really should. It's not anything new, though. So we open up with a clandestine meeting between Spider-Man foe Electro and an unknown shadowy figure. Electro has been hired for a job. Now, we don't at this time quite know what that job is yet. The title, though, is Breakout. And so it says right there in the title page, Breakout Part 1. We then cut to a helicopter that's carrying Matt Murdock, Luke Cage, and Foggy Nelson. They're arriving at the Raft, which is a maximum security prison near Rikers Island. On the Raft, they meet Jessica Drew, who's a Spider-Woman working for S.H.I.E.L.D. Through conversation, we learn that the raft is holding a who's who of supervillains, including Carnage, Jigsaw, the Purple Man, who Luke Cage has a history with. It's also revealed that Matt Murdock recently had his identity as Daredevil outed in the media. After an elevator ride down several floors, they arrive at one of the sublevels. Before getting very far, however, the lights suddenly go dark. We see this major power outage citywide. It's followed immediately by a massive explosion of electrical energy. The raft itself, a big portion of it is like obliterated in this explosion, which looks sweet. We then cut to Peter Parker and Mary Jane about to enjoy a romantic comedy starring Hugh Grant. Their power suddenly cuts out, and out through their window of the apartment, they witness that massive explosion. Moments later, Peter's in costume as Spider-Man. He's heading in that direction. He's running out of real estate to swing from, so he hitches a ride underneath a helicopter that's heading that direction. The helicopter gets hit by lightning and explodes pretty much right over the raft and sends Spidey into the frigid waters. The two on board the helicopter bail out. When Spidey reaches the island, he's helped out of the water by none other than a very badass-looking Captain America who was in the helicopter. Now, inside the prison, a powerfully electrically charged Electro has broken out all of the villains and basically tells them that they're free. Hey, remember who helped you out? My name's Electro, that sort of thing. And just like the title reveals, we see again Purple Man, Gargoyle, Scarecrow, Jigsaw, Crossbones. It's a who's who of villains in that scene. A lot of them which I didn't even recognize. But it's cool to go back and kind of research who was in that image.
Absolutely.
Now, on the lower level, we got Matt, Foggy, Luke, and Jessica Drew. They've escaped from a portion of the ceiling collapsing. With no idea what's happening above, Matt insists on pressing on to see the person that they actually came to the raft for, whom, according to Reed Richards, is the most powerful superhero on the planet. He'd been imprisoned for killing his wife, and that is the Sentry. And that's where we cut. What were your thoughts?
Man, that instantly would have hooked me in.
Yeah.
I definitely would have ran out the next month or however. Is this a monthly title? Is this bi-weekly?
This was a monthly title, I believe. Okay. So yeah, it came out each month.
I would have been in like pins and needles anticipation for the next issue to come out.
It was weird for me. I remember picking this up and reading it, and you think back to the comics that we were reading in the 90s and how condensed everything was.
Very much.
And it somehow, between me reading comics and then taking this long break and then coming back into comics, there was this shift where now everything is written for the graphic novel format. And so it's very decompressed. So I went through that synopsis, and there was 3-4 scenes. I mean, the entire issue takes place over the course of 5-10 minutes, maybe.
Yeah.
So you can't say that not a lot happens, because a lot does happen, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like a lot happens because it's written for a 6-issue story arc versus as much story crammed into one issue as possible. And so that was something that I was really new to. Like I said, all 22 pages of it takes place just over that few minutes. It's really that single event. Despite, like I said, Iron Man and Wolverine appearing on the cover, they're not in the issue at all. They do appear, though, on the team in later issues. Bendis's dialogue, one thing it was very different than what I grew up reading.
Very much so, yeah.
Not a lot of like exposition and thought bubbles, and you think of like the X-Men comics that we did read, like the Chris Claremont huge expo dumps.
Oh yeah.
And you don't really have that. Everything that was given to us was given us in a dialogue format. Again, updating us on, hey, Matt Murdock recently had his secret identity leaked to the press. That was told through dialogue, and then through images as well. I didn't know, reading this, who Purple Man was.
Yeah.
But you could just tell from David Finch's amazing art that there's definitely a history there between Luke Cage and Purple Man, which I did go back and learn more about that.
Well, I think there's a lot of tension in it too, because it kind of establishes really quickly that, first of all, there's no more Avengers, and then this took place, if I'm not mistaken, pretty soon after M Day, or right around those times, the whole no more mutants
right
thing.
right.
So there's no X-Men really either, and there's all these villains around.
What's cool about that, with kind of it being a team book, or kind of the beginning of a team book, so many other team books out there, it's one guy goes around and recruits this person and this person and this person for a mission, or maybe the team's already formed and you're just sort of getting, history on the back end. And this was, the team is kind of forming in real time as we're going along with it.
Yeah.
And so they're not already the New Avengers. I don't even think the New Avengers is ever, an official name for the team.
Right.
It's just these heroes that are thrown into this crazy situation that team up. And then I think that, they realize over the course of the story arc that, hey, we can do some real good working together here.
Yeah.
And so it was really cool to see, Peter Parker or Spider-Man work, Captain America. And again, the heroes haven't really done much in this issue because they're just kind of like thrown into the situation. But it's really cool to see these guys come together. And it had me, like you said, it had me itching for that second issue and that third issue.
Oh, definitely.
The couple of things, the brand new characters, brand new for me, I didn't know Jessica Drew or Spider-Woman. Not familiar with her. And she had become, since that issue, she becomes a major player for a time through the mid-2000s. And then the Sentry as well is one that I was not familiar with. Are you familiar with the Sentry at all, kind of going into that?
So the only reason I was familiar with the Sentry is because of that, and I don't know if it was in this or in Civil War or where it was, but there's a panel of the comic where he flies Carnage up into the stratosphere and rips him in half.
Yes, it is one of the, I think that probably takes place in the second issue of this series, if I'm not mistaken. Second or third issue, yeah.
Well, and not only that, but the Thunderbolts movie that's coming out.
Yeah, Bob.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Sentry's a weird one for me because, it's clearly a kind of a Superman analog.
Yeah.
But, with it being Marvel, they got to make him a little crazy. And that's okay. I didn't know who he was at the time, and really, I didn't even bother to go back and look into him until I think we got into the second graphic novel, or kind of the second story arc of this title. I believe is even called The Sentry, and it dives a little bit more into who he is. And I learned that he was a character that was created early 2000s by I think Paul Jenkins. It was created as kind of a almost a hoax, where I was like, hey, here's this Golden Age character that everybody forgot about.
Yeah.
But he was like brand new at the time. But he was just portrayed as this 1950s early Marvel character, which I thought was a pretty cool concept. Now, despite this being my first Marvel title in several years and not having kept up with, the going-ons of the universe itself, I never felt lost. And again, maybe it's because there wasn't a whole lot going on, but I was able to keep up with everything that was happening.
You didn't really feel like you were missing anything.
No.
By jumping into this one.
Yeah, and because of that, I would say that if you were new to Marvel Comics, even if you're new now to Marvel Comics, and you want to go back and find a really good jumping on point, this is probably one of the best places to do it, in my opinion.
I would agree.
I was super intrigued by the mystery. Who hired Electro? What is the true agenda? Who is the Sentry? All of these things that it was setting up, I was itching to find out more of, kind of like what you had said early on. And so, yeah, last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of, thoughts or opinions on the book, I mentioned, Bendis's dialogue. And while I did find the pacing, again, different, Finch's artwork was amazing.
Absolutely.
And this was probably my first. Was not familiar with his artwork at the time.
No, I was. I probably wouldn't have recognized it at the time looking at it, because in that gap, I knew more about like Ditko.
Yeah.
Stan. Jim Lee.
Yeah, a lot of it was it became really about those image artists. Like when we were growing up, it was like the Jim Lee, the Rob Liefelds, the McFarlanes.
Yeah.
And so it was cool to see this artwork, and it's very cinematic. And that was not something that you had a lot of kinetic energy with a lot of those, image artists, but this was very cinematic that became very popular in the 2000s as well. I think with like Mike Deodato Jr. was very much in that style. Hitch, from like the Civil War art. I mean, all of that was very cinematic, and that was very cool. So let's talk about what happened with the overall series as we summarize this. So there's been 4 different volumes of this title. This first volume ran for 64 issues.
Wow.
There was also 3 annuals and then kind of a special finale, and it ran through, Civil War, which was a kind of a big turning point for a lot of those Marvel titles at the time.
Right.
In fact, following that Civil War crossover event, the focus shifted to kind of a splinter group that they chose not to comply with the Superhero Registration Act. That series then led to a spin-off sister title called Mighty Avengers, which I'm sure we'll talk about that first issue at some time. The series ended at the conclusion of the Siege storyline. I have all of this series, in my collection, plus most of Volume 2. By the time Volume 3 rolled around, I'd sort of gotten back out of reading comics, and it wasn't because of girls or anything like that. It was because the massive events kind of killed it for me.
Right.
Like, it was just event after event, and then I felt the need to like buy all of these spin-off titles, and it became a drag on me personally. So I kind of gotten out of it. But yeah, I mean, at the time of the series, Bendis was, like I said, one of the primary architects of the Marvel Universe. This is the series that introduced me back into the Marvel Universe and characters like Sentry, Ronin, etc. So I love this issue. That's why I wanted to talk about it first, is because this issue has like a special place in my heart. So,
yeah.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I definitely want to go find like a graphic novel or something that just like has this entire series in it, because
it has been collected a couple of times. I know you can get, this, there is a graphic novel titled Breakout, which covers this first story arc. There's also the omnibus that you can get that would have it in there. I'm sure it's been collected other places as well. So there's a lot of different places you can get it. Also, if you're somebody who subscribes to like the Marvel app and you read those comics digitally, I'm sure it's out there as well. So there's different places that you can read that. Definitely check it out though if you haven't. As for this video, be sure to like, subscribe, find us on Facebook. We are the Number One Podcast on Facebook. You can email us at thenumberonepodcast@gmail.com. And let me know, what was the first comic that got you either back into it or into it, especially if it was the first issue. Maybe we'll take a look at it at some point. So with that being said, I want to thank you guys for joining us. For Bill, my name is Jonah, and we'll talk to you soon.